The safe sat in the middle of the street like a monument to arrogance. Ornate brass fittings caught the midday light, while curious townspeople formed a loose circle around it. Magnus Hartwell stood beside his prize with one hand resting on its iron surface. A thin cigar balanced between his fingers. Across from him, a man in worn rancher's clothes studied the safe with an expression nobody could quite read. But what Magnus didn't know was that some men carry their past in their hands, not their words. And what looked like entertainment to the crowd was about to become the most expensive mistake Magnus Hartwell would ever make. Because the man he chose to humiliate had spent 15 years of his life doing something Magnus never bothered to ask about. And when Silas Crow placed his calloused palm against that safe's cold metal, he felt something Magnus couldn't see: recognition. Silas had arrived in town 3 hours earlier, with nothing but a wagon carrying the last salvageable pieces from his failing ranch. Fence posts, tools, a saddle that had seen better decades. He'd driven the wagon down the main street with his jaw tight, knowing every eye that landed on him saw the same thing: another man losing his grip on the life he'd built. The town had a name, though Silas had stopped caring about names of places. They all felt the same when you were drowning. Wooden buildings with false fronts, a bank that controlled more lives than it served, a saloon where men with too much time spent too much money, and everywhere the shadow of Magnus Hartwell's influence. Silas had planned to sell his goods quickly, take whatever pittance he could get, return to his land and figure out how to survive another season. Simple, quiet, anonymous. But Magnus Hartwell didn't believe in letting anyone pass through quietly. The confrontation started at the bank. Silas had walked in hoping to negotiate an extension on his loan. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, barely looked at him. "Mr. Hartwell doesn't extend credit to failing enterprises." Silas had expected that. He'd already prepared himself for rejection. What he hadn't expected was Magnus himself emerging from a back office, expensive suit immaculate, gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. "Crow, isn't it?" Magnus had said, not waiting for an answer. "I've been watching your land lose value for 3 years now. At some point, a man has to accept reality." Silas had kept his voice level. "I'm not here to accept anything. I'm here to discuss terms." Magnus had smiled then, not with warmth, with the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. Discussion implies negotiation between equals. Magnus had circled Silas slowly, appraising him like livestock. "What I see is a man with nothing trying to pretend he deserves something." The clerk had shifted uncomfortably. 2 other customers pretended not to listen while absorbing every word. "I have goods to sell," Silas had said. "Good tools, materials, worth more than what I owe. To you, perhaps." Magnus had paused, cigar smoke curling around his words. "Tell you what, Crow, I'm feeling generous today. Come outside. Let's give the town something to talk about." And that's how Silas ended up standing in the street, staring at an ornate safe that Magnus's men had hauled from the bank specifically for this moment. The safe was beautiful in its way scrollwork etched into the metal, dual combination locks, hinges thick as a man's wrist. It looked old but maintained, the kind of safe that held more than money. It held reputation. Magnus raised his voice so the growing crowd could hear. "Inside this safe is 500 in gold, more than enough to clear your debt and keep your pathetic ranch running another year." Silas watched Magnus's hand pat the safe's top panel possessively. "Open it," Magnus continued, "and the gold is yours. Fail, and you sign over your land to me right now. Everything you have left." The crowd murmured. Someone laughed. A woman whispered something to her companion. Silas looked at the safe, then at Magnus's confident smirk, then back at the safe. His throat felt dry. His hands, rough from years of ranching, flexed at his sides. "You expect me to crack a safe in the middle of the street? I expect you to try." Magnus's smile widened. "Or, admit you're exactly what I said you were, nothing." The words hit like they were meant to. Silas felt his jaw tighten, felt the weight of every watching eye, felt the familiar burn of humiliation that came with being poor in a world run by men like Magnus. But underneath that burn, something else flickered, something cold and calculating, something from a life Silas had buried under 15 years of dirt and cattle and failed harvests. He looked at the safe again, really looked at it this time, noted the manufacturer's mark barely visible on the lower left corner, noted the specific pattern of the combination locks, noted the way the metal had worn smooth in certain places from decades of hands opening and closing it the same way. "One attempt?" Silas asked quietly. "One attempt." Magnus tapped ash from his cigar onto the dirt. And when you fail, you walk to my office and sign the papers like a man. Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, he'd stopped trusting hope years ago, but recognition, certainty, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fade no matter how hard you try to forget it. All right, Silas said. I'll open your safe. The crowd noise swelled. Magnus's smile turned triumphant. He gestured grandly toward the safe like a showman presenting his main attraction. Be my guest, Mr. Crow. Show us what a desperate man can accomplish. Silas stepped forward, knelt beside the safe, placed both palms flat against its cool surface. And somewhere in the back of his mind, muscle memory that had been sleeping for 15 years began to wake up. The metal felt familiar under Silas's palms. Too familiar. He traced the edges of the combination locks with his fingertips, feeling the microscopic ridges that most people would never notice. The crowd pressed closer, forming a tighter circle. Boots shuffled in the dirt. Whispers rippled through the assembled townspeople like wind through dry grass. Magnus stepped forward, positioning himself where everyone could see his face. Take your time. Crow, we've got all afternoon to watch you embarrass yourself. Someone in the crowd laughed. Others joined in. The sound pressed against Silas's back like physical weight, but Silas wasn't listening anymore. His fingers had found what they were looking for, the slight wear pattern on the first combination dial. Years of someone's thumb turning it the same direction, the same speed, the same number of rotations. The metal remembered even when people forgot. He closed his eyes, let his hands do what his mind had been trying to forget for 15 years. What's he doing? A woman asked. Praying, probably, another voice answered. More laughter. Magnus's voice cut through the noise. If you're waiting for divine intervention, I should warn you, I own the church too. The crowd loved that. Even the clerk from the bank, standing near the back, allowed himself a thin smile. Silas opened his eyes, looked up at Magnus. This safe, where'd you get it? Magnus's expression flickered with surprise, before settling back into condescension. That's none of your concern. Humor me. Why would I do that? Because, Silas said quietly, in about 2 minutes you're going to wish you'd been honest about what's inside. The confidence in Silas's voice did something to the crowd. The laughter died. People shifted their weight. Magnus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It belonged to a railroad company, Magnus said slowly. Bought it at auction 5 years ago. Why? Railroad company. Silas turned back to the safe, nodding to himself. That explains the modifications. What modifications? But Silas was already working. His right hand found the first dial, started turning it with a precision that didn't match his rough appearance. Clockwise. Stop. Counterclockwise. Stop. The movements were deliberate but not hesitant. Not the fumbling of a desperate man guessing. Something else entirely. Hold on, someone in the crowd said. He knows what he's doing. Nobody knows how to open that safe, Magnus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. I had 3 locksmiths examine it. They said it would take hours with proper tools. Silas's fingers paused on the second dial. They weren't railroad locksmiths. The words hung in the air. Magnus stared at the back of Silas's head. The clerk's mouth opened slightly. A woman near the front whispered something urgent to her husband. What did you say? Magnus asked. Silas didn't answer. He was counting something in his head. Numbers that came from muscle memory older than his ranching life, older than his failures, from a time when his hands had been steady and his future had looked different than dirt and cattle and debt. The second dial clicked. Not loud, but in the sudden silence of the street, everyone heard it. Wait, Magnus said. Silas moved to the third dial. This one was trickier. The railroad company had added it later, probably after some theft they'd been trying to prevent, but they'd used a standard modification, one that Silas had seen a dozen times before he'd ever touched a fence post or branded a calf. His fingers moved. The dial turned. Another click. Magnus took a step forward. You need to stop. Why? Silas didn't look up. Worried about something? You can't possibly. The fourth dial surrendered like the others. 4 clicks total. Silas's hands moved to the lever. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Crow. Magnus's voice had changed. The smugness was gone. In its place was something sharper. We should discuss this privately. Silas's fingers wrapped around the lever. You said open the safe. I'm opening the safe. I'll pay you. The words came out fast. Whatever you owe, double it. Just step away from. Silas pulled the lever. The safe door swung open with a heavy final sound, like a judge's gavel, like a door slamming shut on a man's arrogance, like the moment when everything you thought you knew reveals itself to be wrong. Magnus went pale. The crowd surged forward, necks craning to see inside, and what they saw made several people gasp, made others start talking all at once, made the clerk from the bank take 3 fast steps backward. Because the safe didn't contain 500 in gold, it contained closer to 5,000. And underneath the gold, visible to everyone now, were documents, deeds, papers with names on them, properties that Magnus had claimed were bought legitimately, but had question marks beside the purchase dates. Silas stood up slowly, dusted off his knees, looked at Magnus with an expression that held no triumph. Just tired recognition of what comes after lies catch up to the people who tell them. You want to renegotiate? Silas asked quietly. Magnus's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and the crowd, which had been laughing at Silas 10 minutes ago, was now staring at Magnus Hartwell like they were seeing him for the first time. Magnus recovered faster than Silas expected. The color returned to his face in patches, and his eyes narrowed into something calculating. He looked at the open safe, then at the crowd, then back at Silas. When he spoke, his voice carried that forced casualness that men use when they're scrambling for control. Well, I underestimated you. Crow, that's my mistake. The crowd was still murmuring. A tall man in the back pointed at the papers visible beneath the gold. Those look like the Henderson deeds, the ones that's private business. Magnus cut him off sharply. Then softer, turning back to Silas with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A deal's a deal. The gold is yours. Silas looked at the open safe, at the stacks of gold coins gleaming in the afternoon light. At the papers underneath that told stories Magnus clearly didn't want told. 5,000 instead of 500. Documents instead of empty space. You lied about how much was in there, Silas said. I rounded down. Magnus gestured dismissively. Does it matter? You won. But Silas was watching Magnus's hands, the way they'd moved to his coat pocket, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the bank entrance where 2 men stood. Men who hadn't been there before. Men whose postures suggested they were more than clerks. The crowd sensed it too. The energy shifted. People who'd pressed forward to see the gold now took half steps back, creating space for whatever was about to happen. Take the gold, Magnus said. Clear your debt. We'll call it even. And the papers? Stay in the safe. Magnus's voice hardened. Where they belong. Silas knelt again. Reached past the gold. His fingers touched the edge of a deed. The crowd went very quiet. Magnus's hand stayed in his coat pocket. Don't, Magnus said. Why? Silas pulled the first paper out slowly. What are you hiding? The deed was for Henderson property, purchased 6 months ago. But the signature looked wrong. The date looked wrong. And the witness line was blank where it should have been notarized. That's forgery, someone in the crowd said. Magnus's face turned red. That's slander. But Silas was already reaching for another paper. And another. Each one told a similar story. Properties bought for far less than their value. Signatures that looked forced or traced. Dates that didn't match public records. A pattern of acquisition that relied on people not asking questions, and officials not looking too close. You've been stealing land, Silas said quietly. It wasn't a question. I've been buying land legally. Magnus's voice rose. And unless you want trouble, you'll put those papers back and take your gold and leave. The 2 men from the bank stepped into the street. One of them had his hand on something under his coat. The crowd pulled back further. A woman grabbed her child and started walking away quickly. Silas stood up with the papers in his hand, faced Magnus directly. You made this public. You put your safe in the middle of the street. You challenged me in front of everyone. And you won. So take your prize and go. The prize was opening the safe. I opened it. Silas held up the papers. Everything in it belongs to me now. That was the deal. Magnus's jaw clenched. The 2 men from the bank moved closer. The street felt smaller suddenly, more dangerous. You're making a mistake, Magnus said. No. Silas's voice stayed level. You made the mistake. You assumed I was just another desperate rancher you could humiliate. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't wonder why my hands knew that safe better than your locksmiths. Who are you? The question came from someone in the crowd. But it was the question everyone was thinking. Silas looked at the papers in his hand, at the safe still sitting open in the street, at Magnus's face turning from red to something darker and more volatile. Then he looked at his own rough hands, hands that had spent 15 years trying to forget what they once knew, what they'd been trained to do before everything fell apart, before he'd run from a different life and buried himself in ranching and debt and anonymity. "I used to work for the railroad," Silas said finally. "Security division. Spent 12 years traveling between territories, installing safes, training locksmiths, investigating theft." The crowd absorbed this. Magnus's expression shifted from anger to something more complex, calculation mixed with growing concern. "That was a long time ago," Silas continued. "I left that life. Tried to build something different. Something quiet." "Why'd you leave?" the tall man asked. Silas didn't answer. The silence stretched. Magnus used it. "So you're a thief." Magnus's voice carried across the street. "Former railroad security who knows how to crack safes. And now you're stealing my property in broad daylight." The words did what they were meant to do. Planted doubt. Made people look at Silas differently. The two men from the bank moved closer still. Silas felt the situation shifting, felt the weight of Magnus's influence pressing down, felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between what was right and what was possible. He looked at the papers again, looked at the safe, at Magnus, at the crowd that had been laughing at him and was now watching him with suspicion growing in their eyes, and made a choice that would change everything about what happened next. "All right," Silas said. He walked to Magnus, held out the papers. "You want these? Take them." Magnus's eyes widened slightly. His hand reached for the papers, and Silas let him take them. Then Silas turned to the crowd. "But everyone here saw what was in that safe. Everyone knows what those papers said, and everyone knows Magnus Hartwell lied about what he was risking." He pointed at the gold still visible inside the safe. "That gold is mine. The deal was clear. But the papers?" He looked at Magnus. "I'm giving those back, because I don't need them to prove what everyone already saw." The crowd was silent, processing, weighing what they'd witnessed. Magnus clutched the papers, but his face showed no relief, because Silas was right. The damage was done. The seed of doubt was planted, and no amount of papers disappearing would make people forget what they'd seen with their own eyes. "You think this is over?" Magnus's voice was low, dangerous. "No," Silas said. "I think it just started." The crowd didn't disperse. That was the first problem. They stood in loose clusters along the street, talking in voices that carried, pointing at the safe, at Magnus, at Silas, the kind of talk that spread like fire in dry brush. Magnus saw it happening. His face cycled through expressions too fast: rage, calculation, forced calm. He waved to his two men. They approached the safe, lifting it with visible effort. "Wait," Silas said. Magnus stopped, turned. "What now?" "The gold stays here until I count it." "You don't trust me?" Magnus's voice dripped with sarcasm. "No." The simple honesty of it made several people in the crowd laugh. Not loudly, but enough. Magnus's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Fine." He gestured to his men. "Put it down." The safe thumped back into the dirt. Magnus pulled out a pocket watch, made a show of checking it. "You have 5 minutes. Then my men are taking my property back to the bank." "Your property?" The tall man from earlier stepped forward. "He won that fair. You made the challenge public." "The safe is mine," Magnus said coldly. "The contents were the wager, not the safe itself." "Then empty it," the man said. "Let him count what's his." Other voices joined in, agreement rippling through the onlookers. Magnus's expression darkened, but he was trapped by his own public spectacle. He nodded curtly to Silas. "Count fast." Silas knelt by the safe again, started removing gold coins, stacking them on a cloth someone had handed him. His hands moved methodically while his mind raced through what came next. The gold would save his ranch, clear his debt, give him breathing room. But Magnus wouldn't let this stand. Men like Magnus never did. 40 coins, 80, 120. The stacks grew. People watched in silence, broken only by the clink of gold on gold. "That's more than 500, a woman said. "That's nearly 5,000, another voice corrected. Magnus stood perfectly still. His men flanked him. The clerk from the bank had disappeared. Smart man. Silas reached the bottom of the safe. His fingers brushed against something that wasn't gold. Paper. But not the deeds Magnus had taken back. This was different. Smaller, hidden beneath where the gold had been stacked. He pulled it out carefully, unfolded it, read 3 lines before his stomach dropped. It was a promissory note, made out to someone named Garrett, for work completed on behalf of Magnus Hartwell, work that involved property boundaries being redrawn, signatures being witnessed when no witness was present, official seals being applied to documents that were never officially filed. Garrett. The name hit Silas like a fist. What is that? Magnus's voice had an edge of panic now. Silas folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket before Magnus could move. Nothing that concerns you. Show me that paper. Magnus took a step forward. No. I said show me. Magnus's hand went to his coat. The 2 men moved in. The crowd tensed. The tall man put his hand on something at his belt. Others shifted positions. The street that had been entertainment suddenly felt like it could break into violence. Silas stood slowly, faced Magnus with the gold at his feet and the paper in his pocket and 15 years of buried history threatening to surface. You want this paper? Silas asked quietly. Come take it. Magnus stopped, weighed his options, looked at the crowd, at the witnesses, at how this would look if he attacked a man in broad daylight for winning a challenge Magnus himself had issued. That paper is private property, Magnus said, trying a different angle. It was in my safe. Therefore, it's mine. The deal was everything in the safe, the tall man said. You said it yourself. Open it, and what's inside is his. Magnus's face went red again. That wasn't part of the wager. Then you should have been more specific. The tall man looked at Silas. What's the paper say? Silas felt the weight of choice pressing down. Show the paper, and expose whatever Magnus had done with this Garrett person. Keep it hidden and use it as leverage later. Or burn it and walk away clean with just the gold. But Garrett, that name, that specific name, it's a receipt, Silas said carefully. For work done. Work that wasn't exactly legal. Magnus went very still. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Silas's voice stayed level, but something in it made Magnus's men exchange looks. I know who Garrett is. I know what kind of work he did. And I know why you'd want to keep a record of it hidden under 5,000 in gold. The crowd sensed something bigger happening. The murmurs grew louder. Someone asked what Garrett had done. Another voice mentioned hearing that name before, in connection with some land dispute that had ended badly. Magnus's hand was definitely on something in his coat now. Crow, we should discuss this privately. You wanted public. Here's public. Silas picked up the cloth with his gold, started loading it back into a bag someone offered. I'm taking what I won, and I'm keeping that paper. If you have a problem with either, take it up with everyone who watched you make the deal. You're making an enemy, Magnus said quietly. A dangerous one. I've had dangerous enemies before. Silas finished loading the gold, straightened up with the bag heavy in his hand. They're why I left the railroad, why I came here looking for quiet. But quiet doesn't seem to be an option anymore. Magnus stepped closer, close enough that only Silas could hear the next words. Garrett's dead, has been for 3 years. That paper's worthless. Silas met his eyes. Then why do you look so worried? Because that was the thing Magnus couldn't hide. The fear underneath the anger. The knowledge that Silas had found something that connected Magnus to a dead man, and whatever that dead man had done for money. The crowd was getting restless, wanting answers. The tall man looked ready to demand them. Others were starting to ask questions louder. Magnus pulled back, gestured to his men. Get the safe. We're done here. But they weren't done. Everyone in that street knew it. This was just the beginning of something that would play out in ways nobody could predict yet. Silas walked away with the gold heavy on his shoulder and a dead man's name burning in his pocket. Behind him, Magnus Hartwell watched with eyes that promised retribution. And all around them, witnesses committed the moment to memory. The day the richest man in town got beaten by someone he'd tried to humiliate. The kind of story that would be told for years, if any of them survived what came next. Silas made it 3 blocks before the shaking started. He ducked into an alley behind the general store, set the bag of gold down, and pressed his palms against the rough wood of the building. Breathed deep, tried to steady himself. Garrett. The name shouldn't have meant anything after 15 years. Should have been buried with everything else from that life. But there it was, written in ink on paper hidden in Magnus Hartwell's safe. connecting past to present in ways Silas had spent years trying to prevent. He pulled the paper out, read it again in the alley's shadow. Payment rendered to Mr. J. Garrett for services concerning property documentation and boundary verification in the amount of $200. Work completed to satisfaction. Discretion assured. The date was 4 years ago, a year before Garrett died, if Magnus was telling the truth about that. Silas remembered the first time he'd met Garrett. Railroad office in a town whose name he'd forgotten. Garrett had been young then, maybe 20, with quick hands and a quicker mind for understanding how locks worked, how safes were built, how security could be circumvented if you knew the right angles. The railroad had hired Silas to teach regional contractors how to install and maintain their safes. Garrett had been one of those contractors, smart enough to learn fast, stupid enough to think he could use what he learned for more than honest work. Silas had caught him trying to crack a payroll safe 6 months into the training. Should have turned him in immediately. Instead, he'd given Garrett a choice walk away from the railroad and never come back, or face prosecution. Garrett had chosen to walk, but not before telling Silas something that had stuck like a splinter. You think you're better than me because you work for the right side? We both know how to break these things. Only difference is the uniform you hide behind. 3 years later, Silas had stopped wearing that uniform. Stopped working for the railroad, stopped pretending the splinter hadn't worked its way deeper with every lock he taught someone else to open. Because Garrett had been right about one thing. Knowledge was neutral. What mattered was what you did with it. And Silas had spent years watching people use what he taught them for things that made him sick. So he'd quit, bought land, became a rancher, buried his past under hard work and silence. And now that past was scratching its way back to the surface. Footsteps approached the alley. Silas folded the paper, tucked it away. The tall man from the street appeared at the alley's entrance. He stopped when he saw Silas. Wanted to make sure you were all right, the man said. Magnus doesn't take losing well. I noticed. Name's Raymond. He stepped into the alley, glanced at the bag of gold. That's going to make you a target. Already was. Raymond nodded slowly. That paper you found. Garrett. I knew him. Silas looked up sharply. How? He did some work for my brother a few years back. Land survey. Turned out the survey was doctored. My brother lost half his property because the boundaries Garrett drew put it in someone else's claim. Raymond's jaw tightened. That someone else was Magnus Hartwell. The pieces started connecting. Garrett hadn't just walked away from the railroad. He'd taken what Silas taught him and hired himself out to men like Magnus, falsifying documents, redrawing boundaries, using his knowledge of how official seals and locks worked to make theft look legal. How many properties? Silas asked. At least a dozen that I know of, maybe more. Raymond leaned against the alley wall. Garrett died in an accident 3 years ago. Horse threw him. Broke his neck. Convenient timing considering he'd just started talking about how some of his clients hadn't paid him what they promised. You think Magnus had him killed? I think Garrett knew too much and became a liability. Raymond looked at the bag again. Like you are now. Silas picked up the gold. Felt its weight. I won this fair. Fair doesn't matter to men like Magnus. What matters is control. And you just showed an entire street that he doesn't have as much of it as everyone thought. Raymond pushed off the wall. He'll come for you. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but he'll come. Let him. You that confident? No. Silas adjusted the bag on his shoulder. But I'm that tired of running. Raymond studied him. The railroad, that's where you learned about safes. Among other things. Why'd you leave? Silas started walking toward the alley's other end. Stopped. Turned back. Because I realized I was teaching people a skill that could save lives or ruin them. And I couldn't control which one they chose. So I chose to stop teaching. But you didn't stop knowing how. No. That stays with you. Silas touched the paper in his pocket. Like mistakes do. Raymond followed him out of the alley. They emerged onto a side street quieter than the main road. The afternoon sun was starting to angle lower. Long shadows stretched across the dirt. Where will you go? Raymond asked. My ranch. It's half a day's ride. That's where Magnus will look first. I know. Silas looked at the man who'd stood up for him in front of the crowd. Why are you helping me? Raymond was quiet for a moment. Because Magnus took my brother's land using Garrett's lies. And when my brother tried to fight it, he ended up losing everything. His property, his savings, his will to keep trying. He met Silas's eyes. My brother died last winter. Gave up, stopped eating, just faded. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, be careful. Raymond pointed toward the edge of town. There's a stable 2 streets over. Owner's name is Dutch. Tell him I sent you. He'll get you a horse that can make the distance fast. Silas nodded, started walking, then stopped again. Raymond, that paper. It proves Magnus hired Garrett, which means it proves a connection to fraud. In a court, maybe, if you live long enough to get to one. Raymond turned back toward the main street. But courts need more than one piece of paper. They need witnesses willing to testify, evidence that hasn't been destroyed, time for truth to come out. And none of that matters if Magnus gets to me first. Exactly. Raymond looked over his shoulder. So ride fast, and sleep light, because whatever comes next started the moment you opened that safe. Silas watched Raymond disappear around a corner. Then he shifted the gold's weight and headed for the stable. Knowing every step away from town was a step closer to whatever Magnus Hartwell was already planning, and knowing that this time, he couldn't run far enough to escape it. Dutch's stable smelled like hay and leather and horse sweat. The old man looked up from oiling a saddle when Silas entered. His eyes went to the bag immediately. Raymond sent me, Silas said. Dutch set down the oilcloth, stood slowly, favoring his left leg. He did he? That must mean you're the one who opened Magnus's safe. Word travels fast. Word always does when someone makes a fool of Magnus Hartwell. Dutch walked to a stall in the back, pulled out a roan mare with good legs and clear eyes. This one will get you where you're going, but she won't outrun bullets if it comes to that. I'm hoping it won't. Dutch snorted. Hope's a poor strategy against men like Magnus. He started saddling the horse with practiced efficiency. Raymond told me about his brother, about Garrett, about all of it. Silas set the gold down. His shoulder ached from carrying it. Did you know Garrett? Knew of him. Worked fast, charged less than honest surveyors, and somehow his numbers always favored whoever paid him most. Dutch tightened the cinch. When he died, I figured it was justice catching up. Didn't realize it might have been Magnus tidying loose ends. You think Magnus killed him? I think Magnus doesn't like witnesses. Dutch paused, looked at Silas directly. Which makes you a problem he'll want solved permanent. Silas picked up the gold again, tied it to the saddle Dutch had prepared. The weight made the mare shift her stance. How long before he comes after me? Already started, I'd wager. He's got men who do his dirty work. 3 of them, usually. They'll ride out tonight, get to your ranch by morning if they push hard. Then I need to push harder. Or you need to not go to your ranch at all. Dutch handed Silas the reins. Man in your position might consider heading north, losing himself in territory Magnus doesn't control. And lose everything I built? Better than losing your life. Dutch opened the stable door. Sunlight slanted through, painting everything gold. But I'm guessing you're not the running type. Not anymore. Silas led the mare outside. Mounted up. The gold pulled at the saddle but held secure. I ran once. From the railroad. From what I'd taught people to do. Thought I could hide in quiet work and honest failure. He adjusted his hat. All it did was delay this moment. Dutch leaned against the doorframe. What moment? The one where I stopped pretending the past stays buried. Silas turned the horse toward the road out of town. Magnus has that paper because Garrett gave it to him. Or Magnus took it when Garrett died. Either way, it's proof of fraud. Proof that can't be hidden now that witnesses saw it. Witnesses can be bought. Or scared. Not all of them. Silas thought about Raymond. About the crowd that had watched everything. About how quickly truth could spread when the right people decided to speak it. Magnus made this public. That was his mistake. His first mistake was underestimating you. No. Silas looked back at the old man. His first mistake was thinking he could control everything forever. I just showed him he can't. Dutch nodded slowly. Good luck, son. You're going to need it. Silas rode out of town as the sun touched the horizon. The road stretched ahead, familiar and threatening at the same time. Every shadow could hide Magnus's men. Every sound could be horses catching up. But Silas didn't ride fast. Not yet. He let the mare set her own pace while his mind worked through what came next. The ranch was a half-day away. Magnus's men would expect him to go there, would be waiting, or would arrive close enough behind that escape became impossible. So the question wasn't whether they'd find him. The question was what condition they'd find him in, prepared or panicked, ready or running. Silas touched the paper in his pocket, felt the weight of Garrett's name connecting past to present, connecting Magnus's crimes to Silas's own history of teaching dangerous knowledge to dangerous people. Maybe Dutch was right. Maybe this was the moment he'd been delaying for 15 years. Not the moment when his past caught up to him. The moment when he finally stopped running from it. 3 miles outside town, Silas spotted riders coming from the east. 2 of them, moving fast. He tensed, hand going to the rifle secured on his saddle. But as they got closer, he recognized one of them. Raymond. They met where the road split toward Silas's ranch. Raymond's horse was lathered with sweat. The man riding with him looked younger, maybe 20, with Raymond's same sharp eyes. "This is my nephew Thomas," Raymond said. "Figured you could use company on the road. I work alone." "Not tonight you don't." Raymond's voice was firm. "Magnus sent 4 men after you. Not 3 like Dutch thought. 4. They left an hour ago, circled wide to get ahead of you." Silas felt his stomach drop. "They're already at my ranch, or waiting on the road before it." Raymond dismounted, pulled a rolled paper from his saddlebag, spread it on the ground. It was a rough map of the area. "We've got 2 choices. Push through and hope we're faster, or take the canyon route, come at your ranch from the back. Canyon route adds 3 hours, but keeps us alive to arrive." Raymond tapped the map. "Your call, but make it fast. They'll have scouts watching the main road." Silas looked at the map, at the 2 routes, at Raymond and Thomas waiting for his decision, at the gold tied to his saddle and the paper in his pocket, and 15 years of trying to escape a life that had finally caught up. "Canyon," he said. "If we're going to face them, we do it on ground we choose." Raymond rolled up the map. Smart. Painful, but smart. They rode into the falling dark, leaving the main road behind. And behind them, 4 men hired by Magnus Hartwell closed in on an empty ranch, wondering where their target had gone. The canyon route was narrow and treacherous in the dark. Rock walls rose on both sides, blocking moonlight. The horses picked their way carefully over loose stone. 1 wrong step and they'd go down. Thomas rode at the back, watching their trail. Raymond led. Silas stayed in the middle with the gold. Nobody spoke for the first hour. The only sounds were hoofbeats and breathing and the occasional scrape of stone under hoof. Finally, Raymond broke the silence. "Your ranch, what's there worth defending?" Silas considered the question. "Not much. Small house. A barn that needs repair. 20 head of cattle if I'm lucky. Then why go back at all?" "Because it's mine." The words came out harder than Silas intended. "Because I bought it with honest work, and I'm tired of men like Magnus taking what doesn't belong to them." Raymond glanced back. "Even if defending it gets you killed?" "Especially then." They rode in silence again. The canyon walls gradually widened. Stars appeared overhead, bright and cold. Thomas whistled low from behind. They stopped. "Someone following?" Silas asked quietly. "Can't tell. Thought I heard something." Thomas stared back the way they'd come. "Could be echo. Could be horses." Raymond dismounted, pressed his ear to the ground. Stayed still for 30 seconds. Stood up. "Nothing. We're clear." But the moment had sharpened everyone's nerves. They rode faster now, pushing the horses harder than was wise in the dark. The canyon opened into scrubland. Another hour and they'd reach Silas's property from the backside. "Tell me about Garrett," Raymond said suddenly. "How you knew him." Silas had been expecting this question. "I taught him. Railroad hired me to train regional contractors in security. Safe installation, lock mechanisms, how to protect payroll shipments. And he used that training to steal. He used it to serve people who wanted things that weren't theirs." Silas shifted in the saddle. "I caught him trying to crack a payroll safe. Should have turned him in, gave him a second chance instead. That's not your fault, isn't it?" Silas looked at Raymond. "I taught him the skills. I let him walk away with knowledge that could break any lock west of the Mississippi. And then he sold those skills to your brother's enemies. To Magnus, to whoever paid enough." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "My brother never blamed you. He blamed Garrett. And Magnus. Your brother didn't know about me." "No. But I'm telling you now the guilt you're carrying isn't yours to carry." Raymond's voice was firm. "Garrett made his choices. Magnus made his. You taught a skill. They chose to corrupt it. And now Garrett's dead because of those choices. Or because Magnus wanted him dead." Raymond pulled his horse to a stop. They'd reached a ridge overlooking dark land. "Either way, you can't change what happened. You can only decide what happens next." Below them, maybe 2 miles distant, Silas could make out the dark shape of his ranch buildings. No lights, no movement. But that didn't mean Magnus's men weren't there. Thomas rode up beside them. "What's the plan?" "We scout first," Raymond said. See where they position themselves. How many are actually there? Then we decide. Decide what? Silas asked. Whether we fight or negotiate. Raymond looked at him. You've got something Magnus wants. That paper. Maybe we use it. As what? Leverage? As trade. The paper for safe passage. He gets his evidence back. You get to keep breathing. Silas pulled out the paper. Looked at it in the starlight. Garrett's name. Magnus's payment. Proof of fraud that could unravel years of stolen land. And everyone Magnus robbed stays robbed, Silas said quietly. But you stay alive. To do what? Keep ranching on land I'll lose anyway when the next drought comes? Watch Magnus continue taking what he wants because nobody has proof anymore? Better than dying for principle. Is it? Silas folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. Raymond, your brother died because Magnus stole his land using Garrett's lies. You said he gave up, stopped fighting, faded. Raymond's jaw tightened. That's why I'm helping you. So you don't fade too. I'm not going to fade. I'm going to finish what I started when I opened that safe. Silas touched the paper in his pocket. This isn't about the ranch anymore. It's about stopping Magnus from doing to anyone else what he did to your brother. Noble words from a dead man. Maybe. But at least I'll die standing instead of running. Silas looked at Thomas. You didn't sign up for this. Neither of you did. If you want to leave, I understand. Thomas looked at his uncle. Raymond stared at Silas for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not with humor, with something grimmer. My brother was a good man, better than most, and Magnus Hartwell destroyed him for profit. Raymond checked his rifle. I'm not leaving. Neither am I, Thomas said. The three of them sat on their horses, looking down at the dark ranch where 4 armed men waited, where violence was coming whether they wanted it or not, where the choice wasn't between safety and danger anymore, just between different kinds of danger. All right, Silas said. Let's go see what we're up against. They rode down from the ridge, leaving the high ground behind, moving toward confrontation that had been building since the moment Magnus put that safe in the street and made the worst bet of his life. Behind them, the canyon trail remained empty, but not for long, because Magnus Hartwell hadn't sent just 4 men. He'd sent 6, and the last 2 were following the canyon route, closing the trap from both sides. Thomas heard them first, horses behind, moving fast through the canyon they'd just left. He whistled sharp and low. Silas turned in his saddle. How many? Raymond asked. 2. Thomas pointed back. The ones from the canyon route, which meant 4 more were still waiting at the ranch, 6 total, split to trap him from both directions. Magnus had planned this carefully, but careful plans required one thing Magnus hadn't counted on, Silas not following the expected path. We can't fight 6 men, Raymond said. Not in open country. Silas looked at the dark ranch buildings ahead, at the canyon behind where 2 riders pursued, at the scrubland offering no cover, then at the distant lights of town, 3 hours back the way they'd come. We're not going to fight them, Silas said. We're going back to town. Raymond stared. That's where Magnus is. Exactly. He sent all 6 men after me, which means he's sitting in his bank right now thinking he's won. Silas touched the paper in his pocket. He's alone, unprotected, and he doesn't expect me to come back. Because it's insane. It's the only move that makes sense. Silas kicked his horse into a gallop. The 4 at my ranch will figure out I'm not coming. By the time they ride back to report, this will already be over. They rode hard through darkness with 2 riders closing behind. The horses strained. The gold bounced against Silas's saddle, but they kept the gap, kept pushing toward town's distant lights. An hour passed. The pursuers stayed close but couldn't quite catch them. Another hour. Town grew from pinpricks to buildings. The 2 men behind them realized where Silas was heading and pushed harder, trying to cut him off before he reached witnesses. They burst onto Main Street with the riders 100 yards back. Doors opened. People emerged. By the time Silas reached the bank, a crowd was forming. He dismounted hard, pushed through the door. Magnus sat at his desk, papers spread before him, lamplight casting shadows across his face. He looked up, saw Silas, went pale. You're supposed to be dead. Your men are still waiting for me at my ranch. Silas pulled out the paper, held it high. So I came back to finish this where it started, in front of witnesses. Magnus stood, but the crowd was already pressing into the doorway. Raymond and Thomas flanked Silas. Dutch pushed through. The tall man. A dozen others who'd watched the safe challenge. The The two riders who'd been chasing them arrived, saw the crowd, saw their employer exposed, and stopped. "Everyone here saw what was in your safe," Silas said loud enough to reach the street. 5,000 instead of 500. Documents proving fraud. And this, he held up Garrett's paper. Payment to a dead man for falsifying land claims. Magnus's face went red. "That paper proves nothing. It proves you hired Garrett. It proves connection to fraud." Silas stepped closer. "How many properties did you steal? How many families lost everything because you paid a criminal to lie?" The crowd's murmur grew dangerous. Someone shouted about the Henderson property. Another voice demanded answers about boundary disputes. Magnus looked at his two men in the doorway. But they were outnumbered 20-1, and they knew it. Violence here would only confirm guilt. "You can't prove anything," Magnus tried. "I don't have to." Silas gestured at the witnesses. "They saw your safe. They saw you panic. They saw you lie about what was inside. That's enough to make people look closer at every property you've taken." Magnus's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in recognition that the game had changed, that the public humiliation he'd inflicted on others had destroyed him. "What do you want?" "My land. Clear title. No debt." Silas folded the paper. "And you return every property taken using Garrett's false documents, starting with Raymond's brother's land. That's non-negotiable." Silas's voice hardened. "Or face investigation, face audits, face everyone here demanding answers about every deal you've made." Outside, the sound of more horses arriving. The four men from the ranch, finally realizing Silas hadn't come. They pushed through the crowd, saw Magnus cornered, saw the witnesses, saw that violence now would only make everything worse. Magnus looked at his 6 men, at the crowd, at Silas holding proof that would unravel years of theft. He was trapped by his own arrogance, exposed in front of the same people he'd controlled through fear and money. "All right," the words came out like poison. "You'll get your land. I'll review the disputed properties." "Not review. Return." Magnus's jaw clenched. "Return. And the gold." Silas looked at the crowd. 5,000. I'm giving it to the people here. Split it among those you've squeezed with your loans and your fraud. Fair payment for what you've stolen." The crowd roared approval. Magnus's 6 men exchanged looks but did nothing. They'd been hired to kill in darkness, not face down an armed mob in lamplight. Magnus slumped into his chair, beaten not by violence but by exposure. When people stopped believing your authority, money couldn't buy it back. Silas walked out with Raymond and Thomas. The 6 hired men parted to let them through, their purpose dissolved by sunlight and witnesses. Behind them, the crowd surged forward to divide the gold while Magnus sat alone, stripped of the thing he'd valued most: control. 3 days later, Silas rode back to his ranch. The land was his, clear title signed under scrutiny of half the town. Magnus left for the east, reputation destroyed. Raymond's family land was returned. A dozen other properties followed. The town remembered the day a poor rancher exposed the richest man's crimes using nothing but a safe the man himself had put on display. And Silas, rebuilding his life, made peace with his past not by forgetting what he'd taught, but by remembering that knowledge could break locks, but people chose what to do after. The safe had been Magnus's arrogance made physical. Opening it had been justice delivered by the last person he'd thought capable. And that made it perfect, unexpected, permanent, and completely deserved. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.